So I'm going to start right now by talking to you about the economy. So the Greek economy has stopped declining. It's stabilized. Indeed, it is growing. After what one can only describe as an interesting hiccup, the Syriza government has been implementing the program. Or at least that's what the people who run the program think. And it is expected that in the course of this year, the program will be deemed to have succeeded. So should we regard the government as having been a very considerable success?
Well, I think I have my reasonable doubts about your statement. What you see is a small cyclical rebound rather than a sustained recovery. We're still underperforming the EU average when it comes to growth. And if you take into consideration that we have lost 25% of our GDP over the past 8 years, one cannot be happy with a growth rate of 1.5%. So in my mind, this has been an unqualified failure. And it has been an unqualified failure because if you turn the clock back to 2014, at the time the projections were calling for a growth that would be closer to 3% for the 3 years between 2015 and 2017, i.e. what more or less happened in Portugal. We didn't do that, and we didn't do that for very specific reasons. We're still paying a price for the first 6 months of 2015. Now, as far as the reforms are concerned, we have an aggressive fiscal consolidation that is using the wrong fiscal policy mix. We'll probably get to the real reforms later, but I would very much question the assumption that real reforms are taking place in Greece today. If anything, good reforms that were implemented by the previous government are being undone.
So you think that the EU officials overseeing the program are basically allowing the government to get away with murder?
What I'm saying is that there is a general desire by everyone to see this program come to an end. And because the desire is so strong, yes, a blind eye is being turned to significant reforms that are not being implemented. I'm talking about public administration, education, justice, just 3 categories where I think there has been significant backtracking. The Greek fatigue is not just a fatigue of the Greek population, it's also a fatigue of the institutions. Whether this by our creditors is a question to be asked. But yes, I think that a blind eye has been turned to specific reform areas where I see a lot of backtracking.
Do you think that it would be helpful for Greece if the creditors were tougher?
No, not necessarily.
With less fatigue?
Not necessarily, because I think that at some point there's been so much talk about the ownership of reform, it tends to become almost a boring discussion, but it is very much true. This government does not own the reform agenda. It's a hard left government that is forced to implement a liberal agenda only to stay in power. So it's not a question of the reforms being imposed upon us by the creditors. It's a question of adopting a real and forward-looking reform agenda for the future. This never really happened. It sort of happened during the previous government, not to the extent that I would like. I hope it will happen with the future government, because the end of the program does not mean the end of the difficulties for the Greek economy.
So let's talk about, before we get to how you're going to get there, let's assume you are in power in the next year or two. We can discuss the timing of the election later. And let's assume for the moment you have a majority, but you still have a deeply divided country, which is profoundly shocked by an immense crisis, a huge recession, and stagnation. So this is far worse than a lost decade. So what are you going to do to lift everybody's spirits and get the economy going?
Well, number one priority has to be to create jobs. In order to create jobs, we need to attract investment. In order to attract investment, we need a stable political environment, a government that is going to make a convincing case about why there are lots of investment opportunities in Greece, a stable tax regime, a relative amount of deregulation, and a properly functioning banking system. So this would be the #1 priority, because there's no better way to lift people out of the poverty trap than to find jobs. The current government is not doing that. It likes the logic of overtaxing the productive economy to focus on subsidies and handouts. That's why it's creating bigger primary surpluses than what is actually necessary. I don't like that logic. I prefer opportunities to handouts. So the #1 priority has to be an investment-driven growth in sectors where Greece has a natural comparative advantage. At the same time, we need to rethink our social cohesion policies. I'm a big fan of a minimum guaranteed income scheme as a universal tool to support the weakest Greeks. It was implemented by the previous government. It's being sort of implemented by the current government, but we also need to send a clear signal that we're not going to let the poorest Greeks fall behind. Obviously, there are lots of nuances and lots of complication in what I'm describing, but the priority, #1 priority, has to be investments and jobs.
Greece is committed in the long term to a pretty tough fiscal stance with ongoing primary surpluses for the indefinite future. How big a problem do you think that is? Can you achieve what you want with this framework and with anything like the current debt stock and debt burden?
You wrote an article, your last piece on Greece, in June 2016.
Good, you remember better than I do.
Where you made the case that the primary surpluses, in one of your scenarios that you presented, that the primary surpluses that have been agreed by the government are essentially unreachable or unsustainable. Indeed, it is very difficult to envision how you can grow an economy with a very, very tight fiscal policy. This is what has been currently agreed by the current government. Can it be renegotiated? Under certain conditions, yes. It would not be my #1 priority. My #1 priority would be to restore the credibility of the Greek government and to focus on supply-side reforms. Once these have been implemented after the first 6 to 12 months, I think the question needs to be raised. Greece needs more fiscal space to break out of this vicious cycle, but one needs to be very clear what one wants to do with the additional fiscal space. One of the reasons our creditors have been so tough on Greece has to do with this perennial fear that if we give the Greeks fiscal space, they will spend it on increasing the size of the state and hiring people right, left, and center. I'm committed not to do that. So whatever fiscal space I could negotiate, if that were possible, I would primarily redirect it towards further tax cuts to fuel whatever recovery we can generate through the structural reforms. I think it is a convincing argument. I think it fits into the broader question of how do we reduce our debt. The numbers do add up. We've done the math. So you can get a debt write-down to the extent that it will be accepted by our creditors with slightly lower primary surpluses, assuming slightly higher growth rates. Basically, the fundamental assumption that is behind what I'm describing is that we have to convince the creditors, the international financial community, skeptics like healthy skeptics like yourself, that Greece is reformable. Because behind all the analysis that you also wrote about, the pessimistic analysis of the IMF, is a fundamental assumption that we can never deliver the real reforms. Hence, our growth rate is always going to be below what needs to be expected. Hence, we need a bigger debt write-down, and then the numbers don't add up, and that's why we found ourselves in this mess.
So let's consider what is needed to become credible in the way that you've suggested, which is both policy, which you've talked about, and the politics. Indeed, it is clear that foreign investors, as well as your creditors and lots of observers, have become pretty cynical. Let's be realistic about Greece. And when they look back over the last, say, 15, 20 years, they would say that pretty well, not pretty well, they would say all the major parties, when in government, have made except when forced to do otherwise, really forced, have made a spectacular mess of it, including your own party back in the early 2000s. So what is different this time? What are you able to bring to the party which should convince the world out there, who you need to be successful, that it's going to be different?
First of all, can it be done? Have other countries done it? Yes. Look at Argentina. You have a competent, I would use a word which never has positive nuances in Greece, but I have no difficulty using it, technocratic government coming in after a wave of populism, relatively quickly restored confidence, attracted a lot of foreign investment, is clearly moving the country in the right direction. So it can be done. We have to make a case that we have also changed our own attitudes as a party. I know there is skepticism. Where do we start? First of all, by presenting a very coherent and well thought out policy program for the next years, by changing faces, by bringing in new talent, and by making a very clear commitment that we have to change and we have to stick to the reforms. Is it going to be a leap of faith? To a certain extent, yes. And I'm asking people to also trust me personally that I can deliver on these policies. Do I have the credibility to do it? I've been a consistent reformer throughout my political career. I don't intend to make a U-turn now.
So look at your party. It's like all parties, a coalition of many different elements, some of which might not be, looking at the history, anything like as enthusiastic about the liberal, rules-governed, law-governed sort of polity you're putting forward. Are you really in control of it?
I have a strong mandate because I got elected through an open public vote. I presented my candidacy. I was an outsider. Nobody expected. Nobody thought I could win. I think I won because there was a real desire for real change. The party is fully aligned and fully committed to this agenda. Of course, it's a big party. And of course, we have to make sure that we aggregate different views. But as far as the reform component of our economic program is concerned, there is no real other voice within the party. This is the direction we're going, and this is non-negotiable.
If you look at the electoral arithmetic of Greece, the arrangements you have on the next election, I understand you have a lead of about 10 percentage points in the polls, which doesn't strike me this far out as a very comfortable cushion. How confident really are you that you can win a genuine governing majority, or at least create a coalition which gives you the capacity to generate firm rule in doing things? The reforms you set out are clearly going to upset an awful lot of vested interests. So are you reasonably confident you can get the power you will need?
I am. People are very tired with the current government. Mr. Tsipras has disappointed and deceived lots of people. He's currently focusing much more on dividing the country rather than uniting it towards a common goal. I'm optimistic, Martin, because I think that fundamental changes have taken place in Greek society that not many people necessarily realize. There is a greater belief than there was in the past that private investment, private entrepreneurship is a way forward. When we ask people, do they want a bigger state with more benefits or a smaller state with less benefits, a majority answers we actually want a smaller state with less benefits. We want to have more control of our own lives. People expect politicians to tell them the truth because they've been deceived by systematic lies. So I think there is an undercurrent that is working in our direction. What is working against us? Cynicism, skepticism, a general disappointment vis-à-vis the entire political system. So these are the two forces. One is working in our direction, the other is working against us. But yes, not just by looking at the polls, but through my systematic campaigning, I am confident that we can win not just an electoral victory, that is probably not sufficient, but a very clear political mandate for change. And this is what I'll be asking for in the next elections, and I think we have a reasonable chance of achieving that goal.
Some people think that the economy might grow this year by somewhere 2.5%, maybe 3%. Would that change, you think, the political arithmetic? The government would then be able to say, look, we've gone through the painful medicine, and now growth is returning. Why risk all these radical and upsetting reforms which are being put forward?
Fair question. I don't think we will grow at 2.5–3%. Even if we do, I think the policies of the government are not necessarily designed in a way to achieve a real trickle-down effect. So I don't think people will actually feel that growth. And I don't think that there is a real chance that the electoral dynamic is going to change until the actual campaign. Again, if we manage a better growth, so much the better for the country. But at the end of the day, it's going to be about coming up with an agenda after the end of the program, because there's a big elephant in the room, and that is what will happen after August 2018.
Of course. Can I turn now to a third? We've talked about the economy and reform. We talked about politics. I'd like to talk to you about institutions. This is both a long-standing concern and a more immediate concern. The long-standing concern has been widely felt outside the country that institutions of governance and institutions of law don't operate in a modern way. They don't operate in a neutral way. Structures are highly clientelist. And then there's a more recent issues, I've just raised, it's pretty obvious, about the rule of law, core issues of the rule of law. How important an issue, in your view, is the current state of institutions and the values embodied in institutions in Greece? Is it getting worse or is it getting better? And then let's move to how you can change something so profoundly difficult to change.
It is critical, it's moving in the wrong direction, and it needs to be changed. Now, let me elaborate. Greece's failure is more political and institutional than it is economic. I'm a big believer that institutions matter and that there is a direct correlation between the quality of the institutions and the quality of our democracy and prosperity. Hence, if we don't improve the quality of our institutions, we will be underperforming systematically in the future. So this is absolutely critical.
This is a central part of your reform program.
Absolutely central. Is it getting worse? It is getting worse. I have a theory that all populist governments, whether they come from the right or from the left, have more or less the same playbook when they get into power, and that is to try to control the media, intervene in justice, and go after their political opponents. We've seen all three with this government. So yes, things have gotten worse. There is no doubt whatsoever that the government is intervening in justice in a manner that is completely unacceptable for a modern democratic state. And this is done by clear directions from the very top of the government. How do you change it?
Is this like what we see in countries like Poland or Hungary?
There are similarities, yes. There are similarities. It is not flattering for Greece, but it is the truth. And the issues of rule of law matter. I'm not talking necessarily about the European dimension of the problem. I'm talking about the Greek dimension of the problem. The level of intervention we've seen in justice is point blank unacceptable. It is unacceptable that the Prime Minister hires the head of the Greek Supreme Court as his special counsel a day after she retires. These practices are completely unacceptable, and they constitute a clear breach of the distinction of power that undermines the core of every democracy. So the question is, now, how do you change it? My answer is twofold. The first is you need to be absolutely meritocratic in the choice of people that staff the government. I do intend to do that, starting from the ministerial appointments to the apparatus of the state. People matter. Until you build the institutions, people matter a lot.
So how would, I understand it from Minister, but so what sort of reforms would be required to make the bureaucracy a meritocracy?
The first thing you need is, which is our number one piece of legislation, it's slightly technical but very important, it's how do you actually run the government? And this is going to be our first piece of legislation. What is the role of the Prime Minister's office? How does it interfere? How does it conduct policy with the ministries, what's the level of secretary generals that you need. So it's a comprehensive package that we have essentially already written, which is the functioning of the government itself. We have a very institutionally very powerful prime minister who doesn't necessarily have the instruments to implement the power that actually arises from his office. Eventually, we will need a very bold constitutional amendment process, which we have thought a lot about. We will be presenting it over the next months. You probably don't know, but you need 2 parliaments to actually change your constitution. So this is a long-term process. It is absolutely necessary. Our constitution has outlived its utility. We need a new constitutional framework for the Greece that I at least envision. And obviously, to do that, you need 2 terms.
One of the cases that it's attracted enormous attention internationally, in fact, probably one of the few or perhaps only specific court case that the FT has written an editorial about in another country, is the case of the prosecution of the former head of your statistics service for what we and Eurostat believes is telling the truth. Could you explain to someone like me how on earth this could happen and what we should understand about the operation of government and law that makes that possible?
I've publicly refrained from making public comments about any court cases. What I can say, it's about time to put this issue to rest.
Okay, well, that's suitably diplomatic. One of the areas which the creditors paid a lot of attention to was the functioning of the tax bureaucracy. So that's a central issue. There's always been a big discussion in Greece. Where do you think that is? Because there is a view out there that in a lot of areas things haven't improved that much, that actually the tax bureaucracy has become more effective. Do you agree with that or not? Is that an area where actually these programs have brought some real success?
Well, we fought very hard to establish a truly independent tax authority. It has been established. There was and there still is a lot of resistance. It needs to be further supported. It's doing a better job than previously was the case. However, unfortunately, the government is constantly trying to bypass it by giving special prosecutors within the Justice Department the right to also conduct audits. So it doesn't seem to be very happy with the independent authority. I intend to strengthen it. Some
people say the government is actually using these powers to persecute people. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that statement, that there has been selective discrimination against people by parts of the tax authorities and the judicial. So yes, that has been the case, but there has been an improvement. We have access to significant amount of data that we did not have access before. We need to use that data judiciously. I think that there is still significant room to improve tax compliance in Greece through basic big data analytics. That we're just scratching the surface of what we can do.
Do you think, delicate sort of question, but do you think Greek people, broadly speaking, are prepared to accept the idea that they should pay their taxes?
I think they will be prepared to accept that idea, provided we start lowering their taxes. So what I'm suggesting,
presumably the quality of the services you provide is quite important, isn't it?
People are tax evading in Greece today. They're tax evading for 2 reasons. First of all, because taxes are way too high, and when you're a self-employed lawyer and you feel that you're paying between 70% and 80% of your income to the state, there's a case to be made of why you may be reluctant to do that. It's not an excuse, it's the reality. It's happening, and it's happening as a result of a very specific policy. So I think the deal is very fair. We lower taxes, you improve tax compliance. We're going to be brutally harsh with people who tax evade, but we will also lower taxes. There is a case to be made why this will include improved tax compliance. We did it back in 2013. we actually lowered VAT for restaurants. And what we saw was that there was no real revenue shortfall. Whenever you go today, there is rampant tax evasion. I heard you're going on a nice trip to Greece. Check out afterwards, check out how many tax receipts you will get in the nice tavernas you will visit. Probably not many. So if you decrease VAT or if you decrease the tax burden, you will improve tax compliance. It is, we've tried it, it has worked, so the deal is, I think in my mind, very fair.
Actually, I have to say, in the taverna we've been in so far, they've been giving us so many receipts, I don't know what to do with them. It's been
Be
almost,
careful, sometimes it may just be the ledger for your order, which is not the same as a receipt.
Might be.
Maybe they recognize you. They think you're someone.
No, no, I'm sure they didn't. Yeah. One final question on domestic policy. Surely what you set out probably means that you're going to have to cut spending. So people don't like it when governments cut spending. So what spending are you going to cut, and how are the people going to respond?
Well, is there still room to cut spending? Yes. Not huge amounts, but let me give you an example. The wage bill for the public administration has increased by almost half a billion under this government. We're still probably hiring more people than we should, especially through temporary contracts. All these needs to stop. There is still waste in several areas which are very important. Look at, for example, public transportation. We introduced a new electronic ticket system. It's not working. Nobody's paying for the tickets. I mean, it's basically a free-for-all. The end result, the deficits of our big public transport companies have ballooned. Healthcare, no cooperation, essential cooperation with the private sector, no real effort to actually cut spending in a targeted way and to actually improve services. Significant room through public-private partnerships to improve, not just to cut spending, but also to improve the level of service. Even when it comes to drug spending, which is a hot issue these days, for reasons which I'm sure you are aware of, we've slashed prices, but we've done very little to slash the volume, the number of prescriptions that have been written. So the number of prescriptions have actually increased during the past 3 years with no particular health benefit, I would argue. Do we have the data to look at all this? The answer is yes. So I think there is still a lack of serious managerial discipline when it comes to managing and doing proper spending reviews for the public administration. It's not going to save us a fortune, but I think symbolically it's going to be very important for the markets to address these pockets of excess spending wherever they exist.
Where do you stand, and have you stood, on this perennially vexed issue between Greek governments and creditors, namely pension spending?
Pension spending has been slashed. And
Too far?
Too far? One can make the case that it has been slashed in the wrong way.
I mean, lots of people have obviously been reduced to something like destitution.
One can make the case that certainly pension cuts went too far, and they went too far in a horizontal manner. And not only that, we have further pension cuts that have been legislated by Mr. Tsipras that will kick in on January 1st, 2019. Have we changed our system? We have not changed our system. We need to rethink our pension system and basically implement what we call a fundamental three-pillar system, where the second and the third pillar are not going to be on a pay-as-you-go basis, but will establish more ownership of the contributions, and we need to do the same both for pensions and for healthcare. So in my mind, yes, there is still another pension reform ahead of us, and we need to be very open. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will entail further spending cuts, but we need to think about the system for the next generation. If you talk to average Greeks, younger people, they will tell you, I'm paying my contributions, I'm never going to get a pension. We cannot go on by giving the younger generation no hope that they will ever receive a pension. People feel that they pay their contributions and it all goes into a pit without any transparency and any ownership. So, I mean, these are pension reforms. They take a long time. You need big transitional periods to implement them so that you make them in a, you do them in a fair way. But other countries have done them. We need to have this debate in Greece as well.
A couple of quick questions on foreign policy. Well, they both have immensely powerful domestic issues. Where do you stand on the efforts to find a solution to the name, and therefore the place in some sense, of what is now called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia? I know it's an incredibly hot potato here. What is your view of what the government is trying to do and what you should be trying to do if you were in power to resolve this issue?
I think the government messed this issue up completely from the very beginning. Instead of trying to forge a true national consensus, inviting all parties and forge a common position, they went on their own. They basically divided the country. They labeled anyone who opposed a solution that includes the name Macedonia as belonging to the far right. They didn't understand that this issue is emotionally very important for many Greeks and that it is essentially the expression of identity politics in Greece today. They essentially divided the country and also tried to divide the opposition. And I think they also made a big tactical mistake. They did not, from the very beginning, stipulate that our northern neighbor needs to change their constitution to make sure that whatever is agreed is enshrined in a constitutional amendment. So right now, and also they never convinced their junior coalition partner that they should join the effort. So you have a sort of an oxymoron that Mr. Tsipras is negotiating on this issue, not as the head of the government, but as the head of Syriza, because his junior coalition partner does not support any solution on the issue. This raises parliamentary issues, but it also raises real political issues. So Mr. Tsipras is on his own in this. I think the window for a reasonable solution is closing very fast.
So you're suggesting that if you gain power in the next election, you will no longer be able to resolve this?
What I'm saying is that the way Mr. Tsipras handled this has inflamed feelings, has divided Greek society, and has made the solution more difficult rather than less difficult.
The second foreign policy question I want to talk about is refugees. This has obviously been a huge issue for Greece. You're very exposed because of your location. You're a country in some difficulty. Tell me how you can fix that.
The refugee problem is no longer a very significant problem for Greece in the sense that the number of refugees that actually come across the Aegean has been significantly reduced. It's a local problem on the islands of the northeastern Aegean Sea. The government has mismanaged the problem from an operational perspective, but it is no longer, as we speak, a big problem for Greece. The flow hasn't stopped completely, but it has been significantly reduced. So it is no longer a major problem for Greece. A much more important problem is the state of our overall relationship with Turkey. That's a problem of a different order.
I think what I'm going to do, since we're very close to past, I'll take 3 questions, and then we'll have people, there'll be one-sentence questions, please. Say who you are, one-sentence questions. I will organize them, and that will be the end of our fascinating discussion. And does anybody want to ask a question of Mr. Mitsotakis?
You seem to have intimidated everyone.
No, you've intimidated. You're so articulate. Oh, yes, there's a gentleman. Is there somebody? No, I can't see. I'm afraid the light is in my eye. Please, there's a microphone. If you'll be good enough to say who you are and one sentence.
John Roberts with the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Not a question, just asking Mr. Mitsotakis whether he would elaborate on how you think future relations with Turkey should be.
Okay.
We'll take all 3 questions and answer them.
Okay, that's a very good question. Any other questions or? Yes, would you bring the microphone to this gentleman?
Hello, my name is Argyris Papastathis. I'm a journalist from Protothema newspaper. I would like to ask both of you if the recent polarization in the Greek political scene around this Novartis issue could wake up the so-called beast of the political risk or country risk that we have seen eating out many of our prospects in the previous years, despite the efforts of the Greek people.
So whether it will lead to actual political
Instability. Yeah.
instability. Okay, it's a very good question. One last question. Yes, there's somebody. Could you stand up, please? Yes, please. Can you see the gentleman standing up there? You can answer these in any length, and that will determine, well, 5 minutes max.
Dionysis Rigopoulos. Nowadays that there is real-time observation of every single parcel that is traveling around the world, the Greek state still does not know its units and its staffing, the current situation. Unless we have that, we cannot proceed to e-gov or to reforms. What is the position for that? This is something that can be done in a month.
Okay, fairly straightforward questions.
Well,
First, you fix Greek-Turkish relations.
I'll answer them in reverse order
Then, okay, start with the parcels.
because Mr. Rigopoulos has already the plan, so it's not difficult to actually have a digital map of the entire structure of the Greek state. It can be done, maybe not in a month, but certainly in a finite period of time. We need more transparency about Greek structures, about the number of civil servants, and in itself this will create more accountability, but we're on the same page as far as this is concerned.
Polarization.
It's a big problem. It's a big problem because we are at the level of public discourse that is, in my mind, unacceptable for a modern democracy, and certainly not in line with what the people expect and what the people want. Is it just a Greek problem? No, it's also a problem for other Western democracies. But the reason why we are in this context is very clear. It was the government's, and it still remains the government's, very, very clear decision to focus on these corruption issues rather than talking about, the big issues of the future. So I'm afraid it's going to be a nasty campaign. I don't think there are clear winners and losers when mud's flowing, in all directions. But we will talk about the issues we discussed today, about the future, about investments, about jobs, about public services. And I think there's going to be an audience that actually would want us to move past this toxic environment. One last point on this issue. The government is shooting itself in the foot with what it's doing. On the one hand, it's making the case that Greece is becoming a normal country. On the other hand, it's doing everything it can to sort of make people who are not very knowledgeable about Greece frightful about the state of Greek politics. So there's a fundamental incompatibility between the two positions. Now, Greek-Turkish relations, we are all concerned about the level of tension in the Aegean. And I've made this very, very clear, both to President Erdogan when I saw him and to Prime Minister Yildirim when I saw him 10 days ago in Munich, that we need rapid de-escalation in the Aegean in order to avoid an accident that could have grave consequences for the overall stability of the region. I'm a firm believer in Greek-Turkish friendship, and I'm a believer that we can work on a framework regardless of the relationship between Turkey and the EU that will promote Greek-Turkish relations. In order to do that, we need to look less at the domestic political agenda. We need less grandstanding and using these topics sort of to bolster our sort of internal popularity. It has been happening in Turkey, I'm afraid, but at the end of the day, I think it is the interest of Turkey, which has lots of open foreign policy fronts, to have a good working relationship with Greece and, for that matter, also with Europe. But we need sensible people with sensible politics. We don't need to pretend that we're big generals wearing nice military suits, as sometimes our Minister of Defense is doing. Not very helpful in general when sort of foreign policy is taken over by these sort of practices.
So I promised it would end at 9:30. I've missed by 4 minutes, which I think is probably really reasonable in the circumstances. I think it's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.